when I started thinking about a talk for myth, I tended to think more about personal myth, the myths that each of us has individually, rather than thinking about, if you like, the myths that we hold socially or religiously in common. And this led me on to think about, as human beings, what's the need we have for myths? Why do we fashion them? Why do we invest so much in them, either consciously or unconsciously? Some of you might know that I worked as a therapist, I worked as a counsellor for over 30 years. And the sort of issues that people brought to me were of all different kinds. But they were very often, if you looked underneath, they were very often based on 3 or 4 different issues. One was loneliness or aloneness, isolation, the feeling of not being connected in some way to other people or to society. Another was finding a lack of meaning in their life. At its extreme, the meaninglessness of existence. And the third one was facing death, was the fear of death, death anxiety. So those 3, I think, were the 3 sort of overriding concerns that people brought into therapy. And it struck me that those 3 things are really big issues. And I think that a lot of the reason that we create myths is to try and explain those concerns, is to find some reason, find some answers for that sort of existential angst, that sort of concern, worry, dread. And initially, I think, if I think back to when I was very young, I don't remember having any skills at all, any way of dealing with those sort of issues. I don't know if I was ever really conscious of them. And the first poem is about that state of being, that state of not knowing how to cope. It's a poem by a man called A.S.J. Tessimond. And it's called Any Man Speaks. I, after difficult entry through my mother's blood and stumbling childhood, hitting my head against the world, I, intricate, easily unshipped, untracked, unaligned, cut off in my communications, stammering, speaking a dialect shared by you, but not you and you. I, strangely undeft, bereft, I searching always for my lost rib, clothed in laughter, yet understanding. To come round the corner of Wardour Street into the square, or to signal across the park and share my bed. I, focus in night for star-sent beams of light. I, fulcrum of levers, whose ends I cannot see, have this one deftness, that I admit undeftness. Know that the stars are far, the levers long, can understand my unstrength. So that last line, my unstrength, I think was really a reflection of how it felt, a reflection of how it felt as a child. And I don't think I consciously started to link in to myth, to a personal myth, until I was about 13 or 14. And I can remember very clearly when it happened. As I think I've said before in one of my other talks, I was brought up in a very working class area, very working class household. There were very few books, but I did find one book on the bookshelf. We only had one bookshelf, one shelf of books, and on that was a book of my father's. Now, why he had this, I don't know, but it was his favourite. And one Saturday afternoon, being bored, I picked up this book and started to read. And I don't know why, but I was hooked. It grabbed me in some way which I couldn't understand. And I don't think I understood for years why this had such a hold on me. The book is called The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Omar Khayyam was a Persian poet. And there were about 3 translations made of this poem. It's a very long poem, so I'm just going to read the first 3 stanzas. Awake, for morning in the bowl of night has flung the stone that puts the stars to flight. And lo, the hunter of the east has caught the Sultan's turret in a noose of light. Dreaming, when dawn's left hand was in the sky, I heard a voice within the tavern cry, awake, my little ones, and fill the cup, before life's liquor in its cup be dry. And as the cock crew, those who stood before the tavern shouted, open then the door, you know how little while we have to stay, and, once departed, may return no more. Now, I think at the age of 13 or 14, it didn't actually mean very much to me at all. But in some way, it spoke to me. And as you see, I've got my father's copy of the Rubaiyat. And I quite often read it. So it obviously meant something to me. It talks about dreaming when dawn's left hand was in the sky. And I think I was a dreamer. I was a bit dreamy. And I'd lived in a very non-dreamy environment. It was heavily industrial. It was quite rough. And it's not easy being a dreamer in a non-dreamy environment. You suffer quite a bit from the grittiness of the people you mix with, of the society you're in. And it's actually quite difficult to know why you don't fit in, what's going on. And I came across a poem which I don't think I came across it until I was in my late 20s or early 30s. But as soon as I read it, I thought, that's what was going on. It's a poem by a man called T.E. Brown. I don't think he's very well known. I've only come across about 2 or 3 poems of his. I think he was a clergyman. And the poem is called Opifex. And I think the first 3 lines describe pretty well how I was a lot of the time as a boy and a young man. Opifex. As I was carving images from clouds and tinting them with soft ethereal dyes pressed from the pulp of dreams, one comes and cries, "Forbear," and all my heaven with gloom enshrouds. Forbear, thou hast no tools wherewith to essay the delicate waves of that elusive grain. Wouldst have due recompense of vulgar pain? The potter's wheel for thee, and some coarse clay. So work, if work thou must, O humbly skilled. Thou hast not known the master. In thy soul his spirit moves not with a sweet control. Thou art outside, and art not of the guild. Thereat I rose, and from his presence passed, but going, murmured, to the God above, who holds my heart, and knows its store of love, I turn from thee, thou proud iconoclast. Then on the shore, God stooped to me and said, He spake the truth. Even so the springs are set that move thy life, nor will they suffer let, nor change their scope, else, living, thou wert dead. This is thy life. Indulge its natural flow, and carve these forms. They yet may find a place on shelves for them reserved. In any case, I bid thee carve them, knowing what I know. So that was, if you like, a confirmation of one of my myths, that it was okay. It was okay to be a dreamer. And of course, one of the dreams is, who am I? It's quite a difficult problem when you're young, when you're growing up. You're trying to find a niche. You're trying to find a reason for being in the world. So we experiment. We try different things. About, 15 years ago, I came across the poems of William Stafford, American. And one of his poems echoed this sort of searching. It's called A Story That Could Be True. If you were exchanged in the cradle and your real mother died without ever telling the story, then no one knows your name. And somewhere in the world, your father is lost and needs you, but you are far away. He can never find how true you are, how ready. When the great wind comes and the robberies of the rain, you stand in the corner shivering. The people who go by, you wonder at their calm. They miss the whisper that runs any day in your mind. Who are you really, wanderer? And the answer you have to give, no matter how dark and cold the world around you is, maybe I'm a king. So maybe I'm a king. But that isn't how it feels very often. So we build a life where we hope we begin to feel like a king. We build a life, we choose a direction, and we choose our myths. We may do it unconsciously, but we choose the stories that we think that begin to make sense of our lives. We may get a family, a set of friends, a job, a career, perhaps. And this is okay. And for some people, that's all they do in their life. They carry on right through with the same myths. But for some of us, something happens. And it may be that through some accident in our life, some happening, we begin to see through the myth. We begin to see that it isn't actually true. It could be loss, could be bereavement. It could be anything that takes away from us the certainty of our myths and leave us stranded again. It leaves us lonely. It leaves us with, again, the feeling of a lack of meaningfulness in life. But hopefully, sometime, we start to gain other myths. And for those of us who are here this evening, that myth is probably the Dhamma. It's probably the teaching of the Buddha. And I was reminded of this. I got the feeling of this from a poem by a man called Rilke. And there's a translation here of a poem called A Walk. And I think this really reflects how it felt for me coming across the Dhamma. I didn't know I was coming across the Dhamma. All I wanted was an alternative to antidepressants. That's all I wanted. I didn't want religion. All I wanted was a few techniques to get out of a very painful place. Anyway, this poem, A Walk by Rilke. My eyes already touch the sunny hill, going far ahead of the road I have begun. So we are grasped by what we cannot grasp. It has its inner light, even from a distance, and changes us, even if we do not reach it, into something else, which, hardly sensing it, we already are. A gesture waves us on, answering our own wave. But what we feel is the wind in our faces. Though just that last line, what we feel is the wind in our faces, I think is, I find really touching, because it's what it feels like. It's nothing actually, I was going to say nothing real. Of course it's real, but it doesn't feel solid. The wind in our face. So we begin to take on a new myth. We start to meditate. We start to learn new things. We start to meet a new set of people. And the new myth begins to grow. I was thinking about this on Padmasambhava Day, the other Sunday, when we had 6 Mitra ceremonies. So 6 people were committing themselves to become further involved with the Sangha, to decrease their aloneness, and to take on a new myth, a new meaning to their life. And I'm always moved by people doing that. And the people who take that ritual are usually quite moved as well, and they don't expect it. But it actually is very moving. It's moving into a different myth. It's acknowledging that this is a part of me now, which wasn't there before. And so it becomes very, very powerful and very moving. What we're not told when we start meditating is, well, of course, it will get harder. So when we start, we find that life gets easier for a while, and we think, oh, this is great, this is really good. This is the answer to the problems. But difficulties arise. And one of Sangharakshita's poems, I'm a great fan of Sangharakshita's poetry. In fact, I guess I've got as much from his poetry as from quite a lot of his writings about the Dhamma. So one of the sonnets. And this is about leading the spiritual life. Reading some books, you'd think the Buddha way, as though macadamized, ran smooth and white, straight as an arrow, billboards left and right, and that the yellow buses, thrice a day, whirled past the milestones, whose smug faces say, Nirvana, 15 miles, by 10 tonight, you'll all be there, good people, and a light outside the Peace Hotel, where you're to stay. But those who read their own hearts, inly wise, know that the way is a hacked path, roughly made through densest jungle, deep in the unknown, and that, though burn 1,000 baleful eyes like death lamps round, serene and unafraid, man through the hideous dark must plunge alone. Which, from experience, that's how it's felt quite often, plunging alone through the dark. I don't have much experience of the highway, straight and white, I must admit, for a lot of the time. So, the myth of the spiritual life changes. So we start to look more intently at life's meaning. We start to find what is really the meaning of life for us. We start to take it more seriously. Hopefully we start to gain a little wisdom. I came across a saying by Nietzsche. I don't know if you've read much Nietzsche, but he's quite hard going sometimes. He's quite in your face. And this saying of his reinforced that opinion I've got of him. He says, To become wise, one must learn to listen to the wild dogs barking in our cellar. Right? To become wise, one must learn to listen to the wild dogs barking in our cellar. So it's quite a almost a savage way of looking at it. What he's saying is, you've got to dig down, and as we lead more of the spiritual life, as we do more meditation and we do more study, then we begin to see that yes, there are bits of ourselves that we need to look at, which we haven't looked at before. So this again is adding to the myth. It's adding a bit more solidity to who we are. And another one of Bante's poems, which I came across probably 40 years ago, and which has always been one of my favorites, says it a little bit more gently, as you might expect. It's called The Root Speaks. Mock me not, O rose, that I am hidden here in the black soil. The sap descends in autumn with the long tail of thy summer beauty, and I know all thy ways. O mock me not that my roots are hidden in the earth, that I love the earth with its moist smell of rotting leaves and its decayedness. Mock me not that my friends are all children of uncleanness, and my loves the daughters of earth. I have heard report of your pure white beauty, bediamonded with drops of dew, and of how you stand stately and aloof among your leaves and thorns. The stars are all on fire for you, and the moon maddened by your beauty. Oh, mock me not that I am ugly and twisted and black. I am out of your sight. Why should you mock me? But tell me, whence comes the sap that invigorates your veins, and the beauty that blushes in every petal? Does it not come with the ascending sap in spring? Comes it not through these roots, from this dank black soil, from these rotting leaves, this decayedness, this uncleanness out of urine and ordure? So mock me not, O rose, nor be ashamed of your father, the root, before the faces of your friends, the stars. So that was an encouragement to actually begin to look at what's underneath, instead of just floating on the surface, to actually find out what's lower down, what's deeper down. What is it that motivates me, that pushes me? What are the myths that are barely conscious, the myths that I don't actually want to see, that I hold? I feel that there's a need which the spiritual life answers very well. There's a need here for kindness, for gentleness, for receptivity, for positivity, which of course we find hopefully in the Metta practice. Because this is not an easy path. The myth of the spiritual life is a difficult one, and it requires us to be as kind to ourselves and to others as we possibly can be. And when I was preparing this talk, the first time I'd ever read it, I came across a poem by a man called Galway Kinnell, who I'd never heard of. And it's called St. Francis and the Sow. The bud stands for all things, even for those things that don't flower. For everything flowers from within of self-blessing. Though sometimes it is necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness, to put a hand on its brow of the flower and retell it in words and in touch, it is lovely, until it flowers again from within of self-blessing. As St. Francis put his hand on the creased forehead of the sow and told her in words and in touch, blessings of earth on the sow. And the sow began remembering all down her thick length, from the earthen snout, all the way through the fodder and slops to the spiritual curl of the tail. From the hard spininess spiked out from the spine, down through the great broken heart to the blue milken dreaminess, spurting and shuddering from the 14 teats into the 14 mouths, sucking and blowing beneath them. The long, perfect loveliness of the sow. So, for everything flowers from within of self-blessing. And I think that really describes for me a lot about the Metta Bhavana, the first stage, which very often we find difficult. It's a self-blessing. So it's just giving you a bit of an insight into what I feel my mythical journey has been so far. And at my age, of course, we're faced with the greatest myth, the one that's been with us since the time we were conceived, from the time we were born, and that is the myth of our death, the final myth. And it's one that very few of us want to face. All right, we know in our head that we're finite, we know that we're mortal, and we'll go along with that. But how many of us live as if it's true? I know I don't. And that, I think, is the final myth to be faced. And how do we do it? Because I don't think there's a handbook. As with most of life, there is no handbook. We pick it up as we go along. We get it from other people. But we don't always find many teachings about how to die a good death. I found if I can find it, I found a poem about old men, and I think I qualify for that now. And it's called Old Men by Ogden Nash. People expect old men to die. They do not really mourn old men. Old men are different. People look at them with eyes that wonder, when? People watch with unshocked eyes. But the old men know when an old man dies. So very often we have to become old to actually finally get round to that final myth, the myth of death, to face the last difficulty. And perhaps in the Dharma, we're encouraged to do that. We're encouraged to face that fact, painful though it may be, instead of spending our life running from it, to stop and turn round and face it and say, come on, let's have a look at you. Afraid as we are, can we do that? So one last poem. And again, this book is called Cold Mountain. It's a book of poems by, I think it's 9th century poet Han Shan, Zen poet. I gave this book to my dad because I thought he liked poetry. And I don't think he made much of it. I think he was more of a Rudyard Kipling man than a Han Shan. However, after he died, I rescued this book. And I think this is my favourite poem in the whole book. There are 100 poems in it. Number 68. The book falls open at that page. So I'll read this poem to you because I think it's what I'm aiming for in facing death. It's one of the ways in which I feel if I can manage this, I'll be doing really well, and I think I'll nearly be there. So after I've finished reading this poem, I think we'll finish recording, and then we'll go straight into a breakout rooms, Akasha Raja. Okay. Would you know a simile for life and death? Compare them then to water and ice. Water binds together to become ice. Ice melts and turns back into water. What has died must live again. What has been born shall return to death. Water and ice do no harm to each other. Life and death are both of them good. Okay, so perhaps in the breakout rooms you could talk about anything that you feel's been raised. One of the things that occurred to me was, could you talk about when did you first appreciate, when did you first realize that you were developing the myths of your life? And can you identify myths you have lost? So, when you're ready, Akasha Raja.